It all started in those suffocating, sooty, and gray streets of Birmingham. Terence Geezer Butler was born right into the middle of this industrial hell in 1949 as the child of an Irish Catholic family. Traces of the Second World War were still fresh, and the noise of factories was the city's only music. This noise was the first seeds of those heavy rhythms that would be etched into Butler's mind. At that time, music was an escape for young people from this gray world. Despite his family's religious nature, Butler took an interest in the forbidden fruit, rock and roll, and the dark literature that followed. Occultism, horror stories, and the harshness of the real world were the main sources feeding his imagination. No one knew it then, but this quiet boy was preparing to write the darkest pages of music history. The smell of Birmingham's rusty metal would become the raw material for the metal music that would spread across the world years later.
Geezer Butler's musical journey actually began not with the bass guitar, but as a rhythm guitarist. As a fan of the Beatles and interested in the popular rhythms of the era, Butler soon realized that this genre was insufficient in reflecting his own inner darkness. When he formed the band Rare Breed with his friend Ozzy Osbourne, the desire to push the boundaries of music was eating away at him. However, as a twist of fate, there was already a guitarist in the band when their paths crossed with Tony Iommi and Bill Ward. Butler made a radical decision to switch to bass guitar during those days when the band played blues rock under the name Earth. But he didn't just pick up the bass, he fundamentally changed how the bass guitar should be played. While creating his own style, he transformed the bass from a background rhythm keeper into a main engine that drove the melody and strengthened the riffs. While the band's name was still Earth, their music was trying to break free from the blues influence of the period. One day, people watching a horror movie playing at the cinema directly across from their rehearsal studio caught Butler's attention. It seemed very interesting to him that people would pay money to be scared. The idea, "Why don't we make scary music?" flashed in Geezer's mind at that moment. When Tony Iommi found that famous Black Sabbath riff, Butler added that dark and eerie bass line to accompany it. Now there was neither blues nor rock, there was Black Sabbath. Butler infused music with today's metal spirit by using those famous tritone notes, also known as the devil's interval, on the bass guitar. This was one of the greatest breaking points in music history. Geezer Butler's tone was a complete nightmare for that time. While most bassists were chasing clean, gentle sounds, Butler was pushing amps to the point of exploding. He achieved that famous loose and rumbling sound by loosening the strings of his bass, detuning. This wasn't just a technique, it was an engineering marvel. Tony Iommi's injury to his fingertips led him to tune his guitar lower, which pushed Butler to adjust his bass the same way. The result? A sound so heavy, wall-shaking, and felt in the listener's chest as had never been heard before. Butler created that legendary intro in NIB by connecting a wah-wah pedal to his bass guitar. The bass was now a beast, and Geezer held the reins. More than 90 of Black Sabbath song lyrics were penned by Geezer Butler. Ozzy Osbourne was a great voice and frontman, but the band's intellectual and lyrical depth belonged entirely to Butler. He was nurtured by the books of authors like Aleister Crowley and Dennis Wheatley. However, he didn't just write about supernatural events. He blended the political chaos of the time, the Vietnam War, and social corruption with an occultist language. War Pigs starts like a narrative of a black magic ceremony, but actually targets warmongering politicians. Butler built the protest identity of metal music by combining the hypocrisy of religion and politics with elements of horror. His lyrics were the greatest factor adding meaning to the weight of the music. Black Sabbath's self-titled debut album was recorded in just 12 hours. This is an impossible duration by modern studio standards. Butler and his friends entered the studio, plugged in their instruments, and played as if they were at a live concert. Butler's bass parts in this recording are so raw and savage that you can hear amplifier crackles in places within the songs. Even producer Roger Bain, who was in the studio that day, didn't know what to do in the face of this power. Instead of leaving a massive gap between his bass and Tony's guitar, Butler filled that space like cement. When the first album was released, critics hated it, but the youth loved this darkness. The first holy book of metal had been written. Towards the end of 1970, Black Sabbath shook the world with the Paranoid album. The title track was actually written at the last minute to complete the album. Butler reached millions with this song. He wrote about mental health and inner collapse. In the song Iron Man, he told the story of the end of humanity through a science fiction lens. Butler's bass lines on this album were more refined, yet just as destructive. In tracks like Planet Caravan, he proved how elegant and melodic a musician he could be. While Paranoid topped the charts, Butler was no longer just a youth from Birmingham, but was becoming a global icon. However, he chose to remain on the dark side of music rather than in the glow of fame.
If genres like stoner rock or doom metal exist today, the 1971 album Master of Reality is responsible. On this album, Butler lowered the pitch of the bass guitar so much, C-tuning, that it was a miracle the speakers didn't explode. Those galloping rhythms in Children of the Grave are the pinnacle of Butler's finger technique. As a master who played with his fingers rather than a pick, he hit the strings so hard that the sound distorted naturally. Butler's bass moved as one body with Tony Iommi's guitar. This album changed the definition of heaviness in metal music forever. Butler used the bass guitar not as a rhythm tool, but as an atmosphere-creating machine. The period when Black Sabbath moved to California and recorded the Vol. 4 album was the band's most chaotic time. Substance abuse had covered the group like a black cloud. However, Butler managed to demonstrate his genius even through this fog. He documented this dangerous lifestyle with songs like Snowblind. Butler's lyrics were becoming more personal and abstract. The addition of piano and strings to the music expanded Butler's musical horizons. He was now a giant in stage shows. Even if he stood motionless on stage, the energy he emitted and the sound coming from those massive amplifier towers were enough to hypnotize the audience. This was a period where Butler pushed both his physical and mental limits. When the band entered a creative crisis, they sought inspiration in an old castle in Wales. The Sabbath Bloody Sabbath album is one of Geezer Butler's most complex and progressive works. On this album, Butler was introduced to synthesizers and blended his bass guitar with these new sounds. The lyrics now covered not just horror, but existential pains and the depths of human consciousness. Butler was the silent power maintaining the balance within the group. Tony found the riffs, and Butler created the soul, story, and skeleton of those riffs. With this album, Sabbath proved to the whole world that they weren't just a band making noise, but sophisticated musicians. The massive legal battles the band had with their managers inspired the Sabotage album. Geezer Butler poured the anger and betrayal he felt into his lyrics, creating a legendary track like The Writ. Butler's bass guitar was practically screaming on this album. Although the legal struggles drained the band's energy, Butler's creativity did not fade. He used music as an escape and a weapon. The chaos behind the scenes turned into works of art in Butler's fingers. However, this period was also a harbinger of the time when the original lineup began to splinter. Butler was one of the names who put the most effort into keeping this crumbling structure together. Geezer Butler's choice of equipment was always unique to him. He used Lackland, Fender, and JD basses, but his real secret was in his fingers. He would pull the strings hard as if he wanted to tear them off, while simultaneously moving as nimbly as a jazz bassist. His rejection of the pick allowed him to create that characteristic full sound of metal. By emphasizing the mid-range frequencies when adjusting the bass tone, he created that famous sound that didn't compete with the guitar, but supported it like a beast. Butler's finger dance on stage was a lesson for millions of young people who wanted to play bass. He was an alchemist who combined technique and emotion at the darkest point. When Ozzy Osbourne left the band, everyone thought Sabbath was over. However, Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi achieved the impossible by adding Ronnie James Dio to the lineup for the Heaven and Hell album. This was a new challenge for Butler. He wrote faster and more technical bass lines suitable for Dio's epic and fantastic style. That unstoppable bass line in the track Neon Nights is proof of how Butler kept pace with the changing times. Although he partially shared songwriting responsibilities with Dio, the band's musical backbone was still in his hands. This period showed that Butler was not just a horror writer, but a genius capable of composing any kind of epic story. In the mid-'80s, Butler briefly left the band. During this period, he pushed the boundaries of industrial metal with projects like the Geezer Butler Band and later GZR. He was influenced by bands like Fear Factory and added modern touches to his music. He was never a musician stuck in the past. He was always after new sounds and new technologies. In his solo albums, he wrote more aggressive, harder, and politically more direct lyrics. While the Black Sabbath legends stood to the side, Butler made it felt in every note that he was one of the most important figures in the metal world on his own. Geezer Butler's influence is not limited to Black Sabbath. Steve Harris, Iron Maiden, learned how dominant a bass guitar could be by taking inspiration from him. Cliff Burton, Metallica, turned the bass into a solo instrument by modeling Butler's use of effects. There is a trace of Butler in the genetics of every metal band we listen to today. He is one of the pillars that made metal not just music, but a lifestyle and a philosophy. Known for his modest personality, Butler was actually the man who determined the fate of a genre. Without him, metal music today might have been a much more superficial and weak genre. Years later, the reunion of the original lineup, excluding Bill Ward, and the making of the 13 album was a dream come true for fans. Despite being in his 60s, Geezer Butler still had the energy of that Birmingham youth. In the album, produced by Rick Rubin, Butler returned to his famous old tone. With songs like God Is Dead, he proved he was still a sharp observer and songwriter. The bass parts were the product of half a century of experience and unquenchable anger. This album was not a farewell kiss, but a proclamation that the kings of metal still hadn't relinquished their thrones to anyone. Butler's life was spent on the road. Thousands of concerts, millions of kilometers. Nights spent on tour buses meant new song lyrics for Butler. He was a silent witness, observing everything happening around him. Every detail, from strange objects thrown on stage during a concert to the gaze of a fan on the other side of the world, was reflected in his pen. Sabbath tours were always eventful, fights, mystical occurrences, and massive parties. However, Butler managed to preserve his own inner world even within this chaos. He was a true stage animal who threw off the exhaustion of the tour by pressing the strings of his bass guitar when he took the stage. In recent years, Geezer Butler invited his fans even deeper into his world by publishing his autobiography titled Into the Void. In the book, he recounted the journey from the tough streets of Birmingham to world stardom in all its nakedness. Butler shared not only his successes, but also his fears, depressions, and his unwavering belief in music. His honesty further strengthened his bond with his fans. He was not just a star, but a human being with dreams and disappointments like all of us. But what made him different was his ability to pour these emotions into notes and words. Geezer Butler may be enjoying retirement today, but his spirit continues to live on in every amplifier, on every stage, and in every bass riff. He is the man who brought the bass guitar to its deserved place in modern music. Butler's legacy is measured not just by the millions of albums he sold, but by the lives he changed. He managed to be a light, or a darker light, even in the darkest periods of music. That deep, growling sound coming from his fingers was the sound of humanity's shared darkness. Butler showed the whole world that metal is not just noise, but requires a deep intellectual background and passion.
And here we come to the part of immortality, not the end of the story. Geezer Butler successfully completed this revolution he started with Black Sabbath. He wrote his name in history in golden letters as one of the holy trinity of heavy metal: Iommi, Butler, Osborne. This sound emerging from the factories of Birmingham will echo until the end of the universe. His silent but authoritative stance is hidden in that magical space between the strings of the bass guitar. Thank you, Geezer, for teaching us to dance with our fears, for showing us that even the heaviest notes have a heart. Metal was born with you and will continue to live with you. Authoritative, enthusiastic, and always dark. Goodbye, the true architect of metal.